the heart of this nation, under skies so blue,
there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true.
from the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.
Imagine a day that just stopped the world, a moment seared into all our memories, right? Reshaping nations, policies, everything really in its aftermath. For over 2 decades now, September 11th, 2001, well, it's been talked about endlessly, official reports, personal stories, you name it. And while there's a narrative that most people accept, it's also true, I think, that for a lot of us, that story leaves these really profound, unsettling questions just hanging there. You feel it, right? The trauma that lingers, the huge shifts in policy, and this nagging feeling that for something so pivotal, some parts are still, well, murky, shrouded. It makes you want to look closer. So today's deep dive, it's for you, the curious learner, the person who wants to look past the headlines, beyond the surface narratives, and really engage with the details. We're going to embark on quite an extensive exploration. We're digging into the intricate questions, the contradictions unearthed by Samuel Carter in his provocative new book. It's called Smoke, Steel, and Silence, What They Didn't Tell Us About 9/11, and it just came out this year, 2025.
Yeah, and it's probably helpful to understand Carter's angle here. He's got this reputation, a bold author, nonfiction, known for digging into really contentious topics. His whole thing is challenging mainstream narratives. If you look at his other work, like The Art of the Smear or his stuff on international conflicts, you see this pattern. He takes a critical, investigative stance on complex, often really controversial subjects. So he doesn't exactly shy away from asking the tough questions. That's sort of his brand.
Right. And Carter himself says very clearly his motivation isn't about tearing down the official record for sport, as he puts it. Instead, he frames the book as this meticulous research effort, his goal, to organize in one place the questions that remain and to dig deeply into them without the filter of political convenience or fear. So that's what we're aiming for today, exactly that. We'll impartially explore the detailed questions, the contradictions Carter raises based on his research. We're drawing only from the facts, the analysis, the perspectives in his book. Look, we're not here endorsing theories. We're just laying out the information from Carter's work and inviting you to consider it with us. Okay, let's unpack this, what they didn't tell us about 9/11.
Okay, so to really start unpacking this, we absolutely have to begin, what for so many people is still the single most confounding question of that whole day. How that 4 hijacked airliners managed to fly around U.S. airspace for like up to an hour and a half in broad daylight, clear skies, radar visibility, and not one single fighter jet intercepted them in time. It's just this fundamental puzzle, right? Yeah. It sits right at the heart of so much of the doubt that lingers, especially when you remember the U.S. had what everyone considered the most advanced air defense system on the planet.
And that pre-9/11 context, it's absolutely critical here, because intercepting planes that went off course, that wasn't some weird, rare thing. It was routine, absolutely routine. Carter's research, it really highlights this. Between September 2000 and June 2001, just that 9-month window, U.S. fighter jets scrambled an incredible 67 times, 67, to deal with flight emergencies. And these responses were usually fast, often within minutes of an alert. We're talking, lost transponders, mechanical issues, planes just veering off past, standard stuff. So then you get to 9/11, clear skies, calm weather, full radar visibility for all 4 planes. And this established working system just fails catastrophically every single time. That's not just a lapse, is it? It feels like a total systemic breakdown, something we hadn't seen before and frankly haven't seen since.
Let's trace the timeline for those first 2 flights. American 11 and United 175, the first real alarm bell rings with Flight 11. At 8:19 a.m., you get this call from flight attendant Betty Ong. She's calm, incredibly calm, but urgent. Calling American Airlines, reporting stabbings, mace, saying there's a hijacking happening right then. It's this incredibly rare thing, a real-time account from inside the cabin, giving immediate, crucial info about the threat. The hijacking itself probably started around 8:14 a.m. Ong confirms it just 5 minutes later. And then, adding to the chill factor, one of the hijackers accidentally keys the mic at 8:24 a.m., broadcasting a warning that air traffic control definitely heard. But NEAD at DES, that's the Northeast Air Defense Sector, the military guys responsible for that airspace, they weren't officially notified until 8:34 a.m.
Okay, 8.34. And then at 8.46 a.m., Flight 11 hits the North Tower. Just think about that. A full 32 minutes pass between the first clear signs of a hijack Ong's call and the impact. 32 minutes. And during that whole window, Carter emphasizes not one fighter jet got anywhere close to intercepting that plane. The official explanation, the one from the 9/11 Commission, talks about confusion, outdated protocol. They said, well, procedures assume hijackers wanted to land, negotiate, not use planes as weapons. But Carter asks this, and it seems fair. Is confusion really a good enough explanation? For the world's most sophisticated air defense, especially given its track record, those 67 scrambles, many defense experts, pilots, they've openly struggled with that explanation.
Yeah, it feels thin to many. And the situation, it just got worse, didn't it? The Flight 175. Just 3 minutes after Flight 11 hit the North Tower, United 175, all out of Boston's Logan Airport, is confirmed hijacked. 3 minutes, air traffic controllers, now acutely aware the country's under attack, they watch, horrified, as 175 deviates from its flight path. They see it happening on their screens. And then 9:03 a.m., bang, Flight 175 slams into the South Tower. A direct hit, live on television. Millions saw it. So from the moment Flight 11 was hijacked, 8:14 a.m., to the impact of Flight 175 at 9:03 a.m., that's 49 minutes, almost an hour. With 2 hijackings confirmed, 2 known threats in the air, the complete lack of a successful military response becomes even harder, much harder, to explain away.
And what Carter details next is maybe even more troubling. He calls it the silence at the top. The vice president, secretary of defense, even the president, they were all notified. They were getting updates as this nightmare unfolded. And yet Carter's research suggests no clear shoot-down orders, no specific defensive protocols really kicked in until after that second tower was already hit. After 9.03, official accounts, they blame bureaucracy, miscommunication, just sheer disbelief. Understandable, maybe, but Carter suggests something starker. He suggests that for almost an hour, despite top-level awareness, the sky over the United States was effectively undefended against these known, active internal threats. What does Carter say was the practical result of this silence, beyond just confusion?
Well, Carter argues this created a leadership vacuum. It paralyzed the crucial decision-making process right when it was needed most. So instead of a rapid, coordinated military response, which the system was supposedly designed for, you got these delayed, disjointed actions. Jets were scrambled eventually, but Carter points out they were often sent the wrong way, or their orders were unclear. They arrived too late. Always too late. The key takeaway from Carter here isn't just that a system failed. It's that multiple layers of defense, layers designed for routine intercepts, were basically rendered useless. By what? A mix of misplaced focus, bureaucratic hurdles, and this paralyzing lack of clear top-down direction. It exposed a massive vulnerability.
And what Carter presents next. This is a perspective that I think many people will find pretty striking, maybe unsettling is the word. His research highlights this crucial detail, often overlooked. There were simulated war games happening, actively taking place on September 11th. Exercises like Vigilant Guardian. And what were they simulating? Scenarios involving hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings, the exact crisis unfolding in real life. Just pause on that. The real thing is happening, and simultaneously, the exact same scenario is playing out on simulation screens and command centers. This isn't some fringe idea. Carter notes it's documented. Testimony to the 9/11 Commission NA days, audio logs, you can hear it. When the first reports came in about a real hijacked plane, some of the very first words on those tapes are questions like, is this real world or exercise? That hesitation, even if it was brief, it cost precious minutes. Controllers had to figure out. Simulation or reality. It just magnified the confusion immensely. What does this overlap suggest about readiness that day?
According to Carter, this overlap created a kind of fog of war, but one that was entirely self-inflicted. It wasn't an external factor. It was internal confusion generated by these drills. Now, some might say, oh, it's just a terrible coincidence. But Carter's analysis argues it severely hampered the ability to react to the real threats. Controllers were already juggling these complex, layered scenarios from the drills. That naturally slows down how fast you can process a real-world anomaly popping up. It introduced this layer of doubt, this need for verification, into a situation demanding instant action. So the vulnerability wasn't just old protocols. It was a system that literally couldn't tell a drill from an attack when they looked identical.
And this confusion, it must have been made worse by NORAD's focus, right? NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command. Their primary mission historically was looking out for external threats, Soviet bombers, long-range missiles. They weren't primarily focused inward at domestic commercial air traffic. That was the FAA's job, the Federal Aviation Administration. So the system relied on the FAA noticing something and then telling NORAD. Carter calls this the fatal lag. It created this cascade, communication breakdowns, misinterpretations, and just this paralyzing lack of clear authority over who does what when. For example, those F-15 scrambled at 8.46 for Flight 11. They were 153 miles away. They only arrived after the North Tower was hit. useless. And later, for Flight 77 heading towards D.C., F-16s launched from Langley Air Force Base at 9:30. But initially, they were sent out over the Atlantic instead of north toward Washington, the completely wrong direction. It just shows this profound lack of coordination, of clear direction.
And this often gets wrapped up in the system not built for this argument. Officials said, look, protocols were for hijackings. As bargaining chips land the plane, negotiate. They claimed there was no contingency for hijackers turning planes into guided bombs. But Carter pushes back on that. He argues that even if the intent was unknown, the act itself, a big commercial airliner going silent, going way off course, that was known, intercepting those anomalies was standard procedure, regardless of why it was happening. The response shouldn't have depended on guessing the motive.
Right. So while that failure of imagination line from the 9/11 Commission provides a neat explanation, Carter's work really forces us to ask those deeper questions again. Why so slow? How did they navigate airspace for so long without being stopped? And crucially, were there prior warnings that got ignored, dismissed, maybe even suppressed? Carter makes a point of saying these aren't just questions from fringe thinkers. They were asked by experienced pilots, air defense experts, even members of Congress in the years since. There's this persistent discomfort with the official answers. What, according to Carter, is the main takeaway from these air defense failures?
The central insight, Carter argues, is that the official story, while maybe convenient, really underplays the sheer scale of the systemic dysfunction that day. It wasn't just one thing failing. It was this perfect storm. Communication breakdowns, confusion over who's in charge, outdated rules, and this huge complicating factor of the war games happening at the same time. All of it converged, leading to this catastrophic inability to protect U.S. airspace when it was most vulnerable. The system, meant to be robust, just seemed fundamentally incapable of adapting, despite, as we'll see, numerous warning signs.
Indeed. Okay, so from the skies over New York and those inexplicable failures, our deep dive now shifts focus. We move to the Capitol itself, Washington, D.C., where a whole other set of profound questions emerged around the attack on the Pentagon. So, the Pentagon attack. It begins with American Airlines Flight 77. At 8:56 a.m., just as the chaos in New York is peaking with the second tower hit, Flight 77's transponder goes dark. It's turned off. The plane is then effectively lost by air traffic control for a critical 36 minutes. Indianapolis Center mistakenly assumes it crashed somewhere out over the Ohio Valley. That assumption, as Carter's research lays out, was absolutely catastrophic.
Utterly catastrophic. 36 minutes. While all eyes are on New York, the nation's capital is essentially wide open, completely unaware that a hijacked airliner is heading its way, circling somewhere nearby. The big question here is, why was it lost? Even with the transponder off, primary radar should still have been able to track it, shouldn't it? Carter acknowledges that, yes, in those first chaotic minutes, there were dozens of false reports flying around about missing planes. Controllers were staring at screens filled with hundreds of blips, unsure which ones were real threats. But what was the official justification, according to the reports Carter examines, for losing contact for that long in an area with pretty robust radar coverage? Well, the official line centered on the sheer volume of traffic and the fact that, with the transponder off, Flight 77 just looked like any other blip, maybe a small plane, maybe radar clutter, not easily identifiable as a threat. They argued the system wasn't really set up to track every single blip with military precision if it wasn't broadcasting its identity and seemed to be an internal flight path issue. But Carter counters that. He says even amidst the chaos, the absence of a transponder signal from a major commercial airliner, like a 757, should have immediately flagged it. It should have triggered a much more aggressive tracking protocol. The problem, in Carter's view, wasn't necessarily a lack of radar capability, but a lack of immediate, decisive identification and prioritization of that specific anomaly.
And what's truly fascinating here, and really central to the mystery surrounding the Pentagon attack, isn't just the damage, it's that so much potential evidence has just never been made public. Carter goes into detail about how FBI agents swooped in almost immediately and collected security camera footage, not just from the Pentagon itself, but from numerous surrounding buildings, a nearby gas station, a hotel across the highway, even cameras run by the Virginia Department of Transportation. Lots of potential angles. Yet despite years of Freedom of Information Act requests, lawsuits by victim families, calls from investigators, most of these recordings have never seen the light of day. All we've ever officially been shown are a few grainy frames from a Pentagon security gate camera. They show a fireball, an explosion, but no clear image whatsoever of an approaching plane, nothing identifiable as a Boeing 757.
Right. And the official reason given for withholding all that other footage, usually vague claims that it could compromise security or that the footage simply wasn't relevant, didn't show anything useful. However, as Carter's source puts it, for many people, the very act of withholding these videos, This lack of transparency has only fueled suspicion rather than calming it. It runs counter to the idea of full disclosure for such a monumental event, doesn't it? Now, if we look at the physical impact itself, there's more controversy. The initial breach in the Pentagon's outer wall, the E-ring, was described in some early reports as being roughly 75 feet wide. But later official accounts often refine that down, saying it was approximately 15 to 18 feet wide, particularly the initial entry hole. Yet a Boeing 757, the type of plane Flight 77 was, has a massive 125-foot wingspan. So critics immediately jumped on that, saying the hole seemed too small for an aircraft that size.
Structural engineers have pushed back on that, of course. They argue the plane would have disintegrated on impact. The wings would likely break off or fold back, and the heaviest parts, the fuselage, the engines would penetrate the deepest, creating that narrower initial hole. They argue this explains the discrepancy. But even accepting that explanation, Carter notes that the immediate visual impression left lingering doubts for many observers. People asked, where are the clear wing impressions on the lawn or the building facade? Where are the major scars on the wall you'd expect from such a huge object hitting at high speed, even if it fragmented? And related to that, Carter's research emphasizes how little identifiable wreckage was visible in photos taken right after the impact. You just don't see large pieces. No intact wings lying on the lawn, no tail section, and crucially, no massive recognizable jet engines outside the building. Mostly just small, scattering bits of debris. There was a single landing gear wheel photographed on the Pentagon lawn, which was later claimed to be from Flight 77. But Carter points out that even this piece appeared, to some analysts, conspicuously small for a Boeing 757.
And the engines. That's a really big sticking point for critics Carter cites. Commercial jet engines are built tough. Titanium, reinforced steel. They're designed to withstand incredible forces, extreme temperatures. They're nearly indestructible. Even in other high-speed crashes, you typically find recognizable engine components, turbine discs, large casings. Yet at the Pentagon, nothing like that was clearly visible outside the impact zone. The theory floated that an intense fireball vaporized much of the aircraft. Just doesn't square with basic physics, Carter argues. Especially when you consider that relatively fragile things inside the Pentagon, like paper documents and wooden desks near the impact area, actually survived the blast and fire. If they survived, how did massive steel engines vaporize? Furthermore, the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, the black boxes, while eventually acknowledged as recovered, were reported as heavily damaged. Critically, no full verifiable data from them was ever released to the public. Only summaries or partial transcripts, leading to persistent calls for full transparency. What does Carter suggest is the most troubling implication of this lack of wreckage?
Well, Carter suggests the most troubling thing is how hard it makes it to do a proper, independent forensic analysis. Without large, identifiable pieces of wreckage, especially the engines, the black boxes, it becomes incredibly difficult to definitively confirm the aircraft's identity, its exact flight path, the precise impact characteristics. It leaves this vacuum that just naturally fuels alternative theories and questions.
And then there's another huge anomaly. The alleged pilot, Hani Hanjour. According to multiple flight instructors Carter cites, Hanjour was consistently described as, frankly, a terrible pilot. The weakest flyer among the 19 hijackers, one said, barely competent even in a small single-engine Cessna. Instructors report he struggled with basic maneuvers, couldn't communicate effectively with air traffic control, had trouble understanding flight instruments. One instructor went so far as to say Hanjour could not fly at all. Yet this is the man who supposedly executed this incredibly complex high-speed maneuver. A descending 330-degree turn, pulling out at very low altitude, maintaining stability at maybe 500 miles per hour before hitting a target the Pentagon wall less than 80 feet tall. With pinpoint accuracy, it's presented as an almost unbelievable feat of airmanship for any pilot, let alone one described as barely competent.
It really does seem extraordinary. Professional pilots, Carter notes, have widely questioned if that specific flight path is even aerodynamically possible for a large aircraft like a Boeing 757, especially flown by someone with Hanjour's documented lack of skill. Groups like Pilots for 9/11 Truth, which Carter references, argue the aircraft, at the speed and altitude claimed in the official reports, couldn't have flown that low and fast without stalling or becoming uncontrollable due to basic aerodynamic limits like ground effect. Furthermore, many eyewitnesses near the Pentagon didn't report hearing the thunderous engine roar you'd absolutely expect from a huge jetliner flying that low and fast just before impact. This absence of overwhelming noise has led some to suggest either the plane was much smaller than a 757, or perhaps its approach was different from the officially described dramatic spiral dive. What does Carter say about the official response to these professional doubts?
Carter observes that the official response largely dismissed these specific concerns from pilots as speculative or misinformed. They tended to reiterate the 9/11 Commission's overall conclusion without really offering detailed aerodynamic analyses or pilot skill assessments that directly tackled the challenges raised by experienced aviators. Essentially, the official narrative remained fixed, Carter suggests, despite significant questions being raised by people with direct, relevant expertise in flying large aircraft.
And adding another layer of confusion are the conflicting eyewitness accounts from the ground. While some witnesses definitely reported seeing a large commercial jet approaching the Pentagon, Carter points out that others described something different. Some saw a smaller craft, something more like a commuter jet or even a military aircraft. Others controversially described something resembling a missile. These inconsistencies persist in the record. And Carter notes these inconsistencies align, perhaps suspiciously, with the physical evidence issues: the small hole, the lack of large wreckage. Take April Gallup, for instance. She was working inside the Pentagon, survived the attack near the impact zone. She has consistently testified that she never saw any plane debris near her location. She insisted there was no smell of jet fuel, and crucially, she heard no aircraft impact noise. For her, she said, it felt more like an internal explosion. Her account provides a stark, first-hand contrast to the official plane crash narrative.
And then there's the impact location itself. It seems oddly convenient, maybe. The specific section of the Pentagon that was hit, Wedge 1, had just undergone extensive renovation and reinforcement. It had new fire-resistant materials, blast-proof windows, upgraded sprinkler systems. And because of this ongoing work, many offices in that particular wedge were actually unoccupied or sparsely populated on 9/11. This leads Carter to highlight the question: are we really to believe that the hijackers, described as generally unsophisticated, not only managed to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace in the world, but then, by sheer luck or minimal skill, selected the structurally strongest and least populated section of the building to hit, with perfect precision? It strikes many, Carter notes, as a remarkable coincidence, one that raises doubts and leads to questions about whether the target was deliberately chosen for minimal damage or perhaps even guided in some way.
Finally, there's the cleanup. The scene was managed with incredible speed. Structural repairs to the Pentagon began almost immediately, literally within days of the attack. Carter points out this rapid repair work further complicated any potential for long-term forensic investigation of the impact site itself. The site was sealed off tightly, controlled entirely by military and intelligence agencies. Very little independent access was allowed, and minimal photographic documentation was released publicly compared to, say, Ground Zero in New York. What little imagery we have came through selective official releases and heavily redacted reports. Now, one could argue this hyper-efficiency was vital for national security, getting the Pentagon operational again. But Carter points out it simultaneously undermined the possibility of a thorough, independent forensic investigation, leaving many questions about what might have been removed, overlooked, or simply paved over.
Yeah, the key insight, I think, from Carter's analysis of the Pentagon is that the official story seems to rely heavily on accepting specific interpretations of quite limited evidence, while at the same time, it dismisses or fails to adequately explain some really glaring anomalies: the missing video evidence, the physical discrepancies at the impact site, the hole size, the lack of wreckage, and these extraordinary demands placed on the alleged pilot skills. It all contributes to a narrative that, for many people Carter spoke to or researched, just doesn't quite add up when you scrutinize it closely.
It certainly makes getting a complete, unambiguous picture very difficult. Okay, so from the shocking questions surrounding the Pentagon, we now need to turn back to New York, to the World Trade Center, where, according to Carter and the experts he cites, the very laws of physics seem to be defied that day. When we look at the images, the videos of the World Trade Center towers collapsing, I mean, to the untrained eye, it just looks like utter chaos, right? Concrete, glass, steel just tumbling down in this horrifying cascade. But as Carter's research describes it, drawing on engineers and physicists, to the trained mind, what they saw resembled something far more calculated, something controlled. They point to the symmetry of the falls, the vertical precision straight down, almost perfectly into their own footprints, the speed approaching free fall, and the apparent lack of resistance as the upper sections crush the intact structure below. For anyone familiar with how large steel structures behave, especially under fire, what unfolded that morning was, in Carter's words, quoting his sources, deeply, deeply suspicious.
Exactly. Buildings like the Twin Towers, massive steel-framed structures, they're designed to withstand significant impacts, fires. They're supposed to burn, maybe lean, even suffer partial collapses in extreme cases. But, as Carter meticulously details, drawing on numerous expert analyses, they're not supposed to completely disintegrate into fine dust. They're not supposed to fall straight down symmetrically into their own footprints at near free fall speed and basically vanish into these neat piles of pulverized rubble. not without some kind of deliberate intervention. What made these collapses so immediately alarming to many engineers and physicists, Carter cites, was their uncanny resemblance to controlled demolitions. You see descriptions from the scene, from videos, people noting explosive bursts appearing below the main falling debris line, these plumes jetting out laterally from floors far below the collapse point, even steel beams, massive structural components being ejected hundreds of feet horizontally away from the towers. The collapses didn't seem to start with slow sagging or a gradual uneven leaning. They appeared to initiate suddenly, almost simultaneously across the structure's width, and proceed uniformly downwards. Carter's work argues, based on these observations, these looked much more like implosions than simple gravitational collapses.
And the sounds people reported hearing, they were equally unsettling, weren't they? Carter really emphasizes this. He highlights how numerous survivors and first responders, firefighters, police, EMTs, consistently reported hearing loud booms, distinct explosions, before and during the collapses. Some described it as a sequence, rhythmic, patterned, almost mechanical, like a chain of explosions, one firefighter noted in an account Carter found. Others likened it to a series of bombs going off, distinct from the roar of the collapsing structure itself. These weren't just the sounds of concrete cracking or glass shattering under immense pressure, they sounded different. And yet, Carter points out, these numerous eyewitness accounts of explosions were curiously downplayed or entirely absent from the official reports, like the 9/11 Commission report and the NIST investigation. Take William Rodriguez. He was a janitor in the North Tower, a hero who helped rescue hundreds. He famously testified under oath to hearing powerful explosions in the sublevels, deep in the basement, before the plane even hit the tower above. His story was initially included in testimonies, but Carter notes it was later redacted or omitted from final official reports. Why exclude such a significant first-hand account? It raises serious questions.
It absolutely does. Now, the official narrative settled very quickly on jet fuel fires weakening the steel as the primary cause of the collapses. That became the accepted story. However, Carter argues this explanation faces huge challenges from basic physics and established engineering principles. Jet fuel, kerosene essentially, burns in open air at temperatures between, say, 980 and maybe 1800 degrees Fahrenheit at the absolute maximum under ideal conditions. Structural steel, the kind used in the towers, doesn't even begin to melt until around 2500 degrees Fahrenheit. And even before melting, steel needs prolonged exposure to incredibly high, sustained temperatures, far hotter than typical office fires fueled by furniture and paper, to soften enough to lose its structural integrity across dozens of floors simultaneously. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the agency tasked with investigating the collapses, they actually eventually admitted in their own reports that the fires did not reach the temperatures needed to melt the steel. That's a crucial admission. Yet they stuck by their collapse theory, shifting the primary mechanism slightly to thermal expansion of floor trusses, causing connections to fail, leading to a progressive or pancaking collapse.
Okay, but if thermal expansion and weakened floor trusses were really enough to bring down these enormous, robustly engineered steel buildings in such a rapid, symmetrical, total way, why hadn't it ever happened before? Or since? Carter's book really hammers this point. In over 100 years of skyscraper history, no other high-rise, steel-framed building had ever collapsed solely due to fire. Ever. He cites examples like the intense fire in Madrid's Windsor Tower in 2005. It burned furiously for over 20 hours, gutting multiple upper floors. Huge inferno. But despite the prolonged, intense heat, its steel framework remained largely standing. Crucially, it did not collapse. So the WTC collapses remain utterly unique in engineering history if attributed solely to fire. And the anomaly deepens, Carter argues, when you consider the numerous credible reports of molten metal, firefighters, cleanup workers, engineers on site. They reported seeing pools of molten steel or other metals glowing intensely beneath the wreckage piles, sometimes for weeks after 9/11. Still glowing orange-yellow. This is just absolutely not consistent with jet fuel or standard office fires. They simply don't burn hot enough or long enough in one spot to melt large quantities of steel or keep it molten for weeks. What was the official explanation for these persistent reports of molten metal?
Well, the official reports from NIST largely dismissed these molten metal observations. They sometimes attributed them to molten aluminum from the aircraft bodies, since aluminum melts at a much lower temperature, around 1220 degrees Fahrenheit. However, Carter, citing scientists like Dr. Stephen Jones, argues that molten aluminum wouldn't explain pools of metal glowing yellow-white, indicating much higher temperatures consistent with iron or steel weeks later. Aluminum cools much faster and typically appears silvery when molten. This is where the potential connection to thermite becomes particularly relevant, according to Carter's sources. Thermite is this pyrotechnic mixture, usually aluminum powder and iron oxide, that, when ignited, undergoes a reaction generating extremely high temperatures, well over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than jet fuel fires, easily capable of melting or even cutting through structural steel. And crucially, thermite reactions leave behind very specific chemical fingerprints, residues of aluminum oxide and distinctive tiny spheres of molten iron called iron microspheres. Carter highlights research by independent scientists who analyzed WTC dust samples and reported finding precisely these residues, nanothermite particles, and iron microspheres in significant quantities. Yet the official NIST reports didn't even test for explosive residues like thermite, a decision Carter finds scientifically inexplicable and a major omission.
And the sheer completeness of the pulverization, that's another really striking anomaly Carter focuses on. Looking at the debris pile, there were virtually no large intact sections left standing from above the impact zones. No huge chunks of floors pancaked neatly on top of each other, as you might expect in a simple gravitational collapse. Almost everything, concrete floors, steel beams, office furniture, filing cabinets, computers, even toilets, seem to have turned to this fine dust and relatively small pieces of debris. Concrete floors, weighing thousands of tons each, were pulverized into micron-sized particles that blanketed lower Manhattan in inches of thick gray dust. Carter argues this level of pulverization is utterly inconsistent with a conventional fire-induced collapse.
Yet, this phenomenon, according to the experts Carter consults, just isn't consistent with fire or gravity alone doing the work. It points towards a massive release of energy, far beyond the potential energy of the collapsing structure or the heat energy from the fires. It's more consistent, they argue, with high-energy events like widespread explosives, thermite reactions cutting steel supports, or perhaps even more exotic demolition technologies designed to disintegrate materials. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, the cleanup operation began with shocking speed. Instead of meticulously treating Ground Zero as a forensic crime scene, which would mean carefully preserving evidence, mapping debris locations, analyzing steel for explosive residue, the vast majority of the debris was rapidly scooped up and trucked away. Much of the steel, potentially holding crucial clues, was shipped off to landfills or, incredibly, sold as scrap metal, much of it ending up in China and India for recycling. This rapid removal, Carter argues, effectively made any thorough, independent forensic analysis of the steel impossible. Whatever evidence might have been present from cutting charges, thermitic residue, unusual metallurgical properties, was now lost forever.
And then, separate from the Twin Towers, there's the equally puzzling case of World Trade Center 7, WTC 7. A modern 47-story skyscraper located a block away from the main WTC complex. Critically, this building was not hit by an airplane. It sustained some fire damage on several floors, ignited by debris from the collapse of the North Tower nearby, and some reported structural damage from that debris. Yet late in the afternoon on 9/11, around 5:20 p.m., WTC 7 suddenly collapsed completely into its own footprint in less than 7 seconds. It looked, for all the world, exactly like a standard controlled demolition, again seemingly defying conventional understanding of fire-induced structural failure. The official explanation from NIST, which took years to finalize, blamed the collapse on normal office fires, causing thermal expansion in floor beams on a few key floors. This supposedly led to the failure of single critical column 79, which then triggered a rapid cascading failure of the entire internal structure, bringing the whole building down.
This explanation, however, raised far more questions than it answered for many architects and engineers Carter spoke with or cited. He underscores that, again, never before in history had a steel-framed high-rise collapsed solely due to fire. And it hasn't happened since. WTC 7 remains this singular, unprecedented event if you accept the fire-only explanation. And Carter highlights the fact that NIST, in its final report, initially denied but was forced to later admit, after challenges from independent researchers, that WTC 7 descended at absolute free-fall acceleration for a significant portion of its collapse, about 2.25 seconds, over roughly 8 stories. Free fall means zero structural resistance. None. For that to happen, all the supporting columns underneath that falling section must have been removed essentially simultaneously. In physics terms, it's as if the lower portion of the building simply ceased to exist for that duration. Fires do not do that. They cause slow, gradual, uneven weakening. Progressive collapse, by definition, involves resistance as floors pancake. Only a deliberate, synchronized removal of structural supports across the building's width can produce true freefall. What was NIST's ultimate explanation for this acknowledged period of freefall, given that fires don't cause instantaneous total support removal?
Well, NIST's final report on WTC 7, which came out in 2008, tried to account for the freefall by modeling a complex hypothetical sequence. They argued that after the initial failure of column 79 due to fire-induced expansion, a cascade of internal structural failures occurred very rapidly. This supposedly led to the simultaneous buckling of all the core and perimeter columns over several floors, effectively removing their support for that brief 2.25-second period. However, Carter notes this explanation remains highly controversial among many structural engineers and physicists. They argue it requires an extraordinary, unprecedented, and perfectly timed sequence of failures, all initiated by normal office fires, to achieve that symmetrical freefall collapse. It stretches credulity for many experts.
And once again, just like with the Twin Towers, you have eyewitness accounts that seem to contradict the official fire-only story for WTC-7. Multiple first responders on the scene reported hearing sharp, repetitive explosions coming from within Building 7 well before its collapse. Some even reported being warned that the building was going to be brought down or pulled. One firefighter, quoted anonymously in Carter's research but widely cited elsewhere, vividly described it as like a countdown, boom, 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 and then it was gone. That sounds much more like a planned demolition sequence than a gradual structural failure due to fire.
And this brings us squarely to the issue of silencing scientific dissent, which is a significant theme in Carter's research on the WTC collapses. He profiles figures like Dr. Stephen E. Jones, a physicist then at Brigham Young University. Jones wasn't some unknown. He'd collaborated with the U.S. Department of Energy on fusion research. He raised serious, published, peer-reviewed questions about the WTC collapses, specifically focusing on the evidence for thermitic residue, the iron-rich microspheres found in the dust, and energy signatures he argued were incompatible with gravitational collapse alone. He wasn't a lone wolf collaborating with other scientists, yet his research was widely dismissed by official bodies, and he eventually faced professional repercussions, being placed on leave and later retiring from BYU amid the controversy. Even more striking, perhaps, was the experience of Kevin Ryan. At the time, Ryan was a site manager at Underwriters Laboratories, or UL, the very organization that had actually tested and certified the fire resistance of the steel components used in the World Trade Center towers. Ryan went public, stating that based on UL's own testing and certifications, the steel should not have failed under the conditions described by NIST. He essentially called NIST's theory of collapse due to heat baseless, given UL's own data on the steel's fire resistance. What was UL's response to Ryan's claims coming from one of their own managers, and what happened to his career there?
UL's response was immediate and decisive. Kevin Ryan was promptly fired after speaking out. Carter presents this, as many others have, as a clear act of retaliation for daring to challenge the official narrative from within a highly credible, relevant institution. It sent a chilling message. And NIST's own investigations, Carter points out, had significant limitations that drew criticism. Their computer simulations modeling the collapses were not peer-reviewed in the traditional scientific sense before being finalized. And remarkably, the simulations they presented often ended prior to the actual collapse initiation, essentially assuming the collapse would happen rather than demonstrating precisely how the global failure began from the initiating events. When challenged on these points and the lack of explanation for the total collapse progression, NIST officials sometimes claimed the final collapse was simply inevitable once initiated. Carter's source critiques this as surrender, not science. It sidesteps the fundamental physics question of how the collapse initiated and progressed with such speed and totality. In stark contrast, Carter highlights the work of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. This is now a large organization boasting thousands of members with verified credentials in architecture, engineering, physics, and related fields. Their independent modeling and analysis consistently concluded that only the simultaneous, near-instantaneous removal of key structural elements across multiple floors, consistent with controlled demolition, could plausibly explain the observed speed, symmetry, and completeness of the WTC Twin Tower and WTC-7 collapses.
Okay, the key insight here, drawing from Carter's detailed analysis of the WTC collapses, seems to be this. The official narrative, attributing the destruction solely to fire and impact damage, appears to clash significantly with well-established principles of physics and structural engineering, especially when you look closely at the speed, the symmetry, the pulverization, the molten metal reports, the eyewitness accounts of explosions, and particularly the unprecedented collapse of WTC-7, which wasn't even hit by a plane. It all points, Carter suggests, towards a mechanism of destruction far beyond what conventional fire and structural failure can readily explain. So, with the physics seemingly screaming these questions, why did the mainstream narrative remain so rigid, so resistant to these challenges? That brings us to the next crucial piece of the puzzle, according to Carter, the role of the media. In the absolute chaos of that morning, September 11th, the media wielded this extraordinary power, didn't they? Not just reporting events as they happened, but interpreting them, instantly, in real time, shaping how we all understood what was going on. And what emerged, Carter points out, was an immediate and remarkably unified narrative. Phrases like, America under attack, an act of war, the face of evil. They became instant staples across all the major networks, almost like everyone got the same memo. Osama bin Laden's name. It surfaced on cable news less than an hour after the second tower collapsed. Al-Qaeda was instantly identified and accepted as the self-evident villain. There was very little initial questioning, just immediate acceptance.
And this narrative wasn't just floating out there. It was actively reinforced by the government itself. President Bush's address from the White House that evening. Carter notes it echoed, almost word for word, the exact language the news anchors have been using all day long. It created this powerful feedback loop. Meanwhile, the networks replayed the footage relentlessly, on a continuous loop. The planes hitting, the towers falling, the Pentagon burning, over and over. Carter argues this constant repetition served to embed the trauma deep into the national psyche. And critically, it kept the focus squarely on the horror, the suffering, and the designated enemy Al-Qaeda. It naturally diverted attention away from potentially awkward questions about the evidence, the lack thereof, or any potential failures in preparedness or response. What in Carter's view was the ethical implication of this near-instantaneous narrative control exercised by the media?
Carter argues pretty strongly that this immediate, unified narrative, while maybe understandable in a moment of profound national shock and grief, effectively bypassed crucial journalistic responsibilities. Instead of maintaining a skeptical, investigative stance, asking the hard how and why questions right away, the media largely adopted this role of, well, national rallying cry, cheering section almost. And that impulse, he suggests, inherently limited its capacity to seriously question official explanations as they emerged, or to explore the anomalies we've been discussing. He thinks this had really long-term negative implications for public trust and critical thinking about the event and its aftermath.
And Carter suggests this wasn't just an accident or purely driven by patriotism. His work delves into the underlying financial structures. Many of the major media conglomerates at the time had significant documented ties to defense contractors and powerful political lobbyists. This created, he argues, a powerful incentive, conscious or not, to maintain a singular narrative that clearly justified a massive, robust, and very profitable military response. He gives the example of GE, which owned NBC at the time. GE also held military contracts worth billions of dollars. So you have this potential conflict of interest. Carter's source describes it as a dangerous feedback loop, where, quote, the business of war and the business of media were not isolated from each other, but actually deeply intertwined.
That sounds like a pretty significant potential conflict of interest. How did Carter suggest these financial incentives actually played out? Did they manifest in specific editorial decisions or maybe journalistic practices he uncovered?
Carter suggests these ties fostered an environment where a certain amount of self-censorship, or at least narrative alignment, became kind of the norm. He points to accounts from journalists suggesting that in editorial meetings, stories supporting the official viewpoint were prioritized. Questions or leads that might complicate the emerging war on terror narrative were often downplayed, discouraged, or outright dismissed as not credible or fringe, often without much real investigation to determine their credibility. So it wasn't always necessarily explicit censorship from the top down, Carter argues, but more of an implicit understanding within the industry. An understanding of what kinds of stories were considered safe or responsible in that climate, and what kinds of stories might jeopardize corporate interests, advertising revenue, or crucial access to powerful government sources.
And the chilling effect this climate had on any form of dissent was profound, wasn't it? Anyone who dared challenge the emerging narrative, who asked uncomfortable questions, was almost immediately smeared, labeled unpatriotic, insensitive, sometimes even terrorist sympathizers. It was incredibly harsh. Inside newsrooms, Carter reports, citing journalists who later spoke out, questions about inconsistencies in the official story or critical examination of government narratives were routinely shut down by editors. Investigative leads that strayed too far from the official version, dismissed without follow-up. Journalists, understandably perhaps, feared being labeled disloyal, losing their access to briefings, maybe even losing their jobs. It created a very constrained environment for real investigative journalism.
Yeah, and Carter points to specific high-profile examples of this silencing effect. Dan Rather at CBS, a giant of broadcast news, he aired some segments raising questions about inconsistencies early on, but faced significant internal resistance and eventually lost his anchor position under controversial circumstances related to other reporting. Even more stark, maybe, was the case of Phil Donahue. He had the highest-rated show on MSNBC at the time. But he was fired. Why? Primarily because he gave airtime to anti-war voices and persistently asked probing questions about the administration's justifications for invading Iraq, which was being linked directly to 9/11. Internal MSNBC memos later surfaced, revealing that management felt his critical stance made him a difficult public face for the network during wartime. Ratings didn't matter as much as narrative conformity.
And this suppression wasn't just limited to big media figures, right? Carter highlights cases involving crucial witnesses. Remember Barry Jennings, the New York City emergency coordinator? He gave early compelling testimony about hearing explosions inside WTC-7 before it collapsed. His account directly contradicted the official narrative that only fires brought it down. Carter's research notes, disturbingly, that Jennings died under somewhat unexplained circumstances just days before the final NIST report on WTC-7, the report providing the official explanation was due to be released. It's a coincidence that raises eyebrows. Similarly, April Gallup, the Pentagon survivor we mentioned earlier, she insisted she saw no plane debris at her location, smelled no jet fuel, heard no plane impact, describing it more like an internal bomb. Her powerful first-hand account was never widely circulated by major media outlets. It remained largely confined to alternative sources.
And you have to ask, as Carter does, if her story or Jennings' story had received the same level of mainstream exposure as the account supporting the official narrative, would public perception of the Pentagon incident or the WTC-7 collapse have shifted? That question itself, Carter's source states, seems to be too dangerous for many outlets to ask, even years later. It really speaks volumes about the power of narrative management and the boundaries placed around acceptable discourse during that period. This management extended even to the subtle use of language. Think about the term ground zero. Before 9/11, Carter notes, that term was primarily associated with the epicenter of nuclear detonations. Repurposing it instantly for the World Trade Center site carried immense psychological weight. It implicitly framed the attacks as something akin to a nuclear act of war, which then helped justify almost any level of military response, both domestically with surveillance and internationally with invasions.
It's pretty clear looking at Carter's analysis that this wasn't always just objective journalism happening. It often felt more like active narrative management. The press, in many crucial instances, seemed to shift from its traditional watchdog role to something more like a lapdog, or at least a cheerleader, for the official line. And few within the mainstream were willing to admit that publicly at the time. The key insight from Carter here, I think, is that in the immediate, highly emotional aftermath of 9/11, the media, driven by a potent mix of genuine patriotic feeling, intense pressure, and significant corporate interests, largely abdicated its critical, questioning function. This allowed a singular narrative to consolidate very quickly, effectively suppressing legitimate inquiry and alternative perspectives. And this careful management of public perception wasn't just about controlling information flow. Carter argues it was also deeply intertwined with powerful financial interests that stood to gain from the unfolding tragedy. The price of this tragedy, unfortunately, went far beyond the devastating human cost. Samuel Carter's work digs into some really profound financial anomalies, starting right in the stock market. He details how, in the days immediately leading up to September 11th, there was this unusually large, statistically significant volume of put options placed on the stocks of two specific companies, United Airlines and American Airlines, the very airlines whose planes were hijacked and used in the attacks.
Right. And a put option, just for clarity for anyone listening, it's basically a financial bet. You're betting that a specific stock's price is going to fall. If it does drop below a certain price by a certain date, you profit, often substantially. So after the 9/11 attacks, when air travel was grounded and the stock prices of those airlines absolutely plummeted, the holders of those strategically placed put options stood to make and did make enormous gains, millions and millions of dollars. Carter notes similar suspicious trading patterns appeared in the stocks of certain reinsurance firms, companies like Munich Re and Swiss Re, firms that would face massive payouts for the property damage at the World Trade Center. Bets were placed that their stock would fall. And also, interestingly, unusual call options, bets that a stock price will rise, were placed on certain defense contractors, like Raytheon, who stood to benefit massively from the military response that followed. These patterns immediately raised red flags among financial regulators worldwide, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC here in the U.S.
The SEC did launch investigations into these trades, didn't they? Carter acknowledges that. But what was the outcome? Well, Carter reports that in the end, the findings were kind of buried, released in vague reports that concluded, essentially, that while the trading was suspicious, no clear, provable evidence of illegal insider trading based on foreknowledge of the attacks could be definitively established. And crucially, the names of the individuals or entities who actually placed these highly profitable trades were never released to the public. The SEC cited privacy concerns. But Carter points out an interesting connection regarding where some of these trades were processed. A significant portion, particularly the airline puts, were cleared through a U.S. subsidiary of Deutsche Bank called Alex Brown, and who used to head Alex Brown, a man named A.B. Buzzy Krongard. He left the firm in 1998 to take a very senior position, executive director, number 3 role at the CIA. What does Carter suggest about the implications of this particular overlap of personnel, institutions, and timing?
Carter is careful not to claim definitive proof of wrongdoing based on this connection alone. However, he suggests the Krongard link inevitably raises significant questions. Questions about potential insider knowledge, or at least sensitive connections within the intelligence community that could theoretically have been exploited for financial gain by someone. The complete lack of transparency regarding who actually made those trades, combined with such high-level, relevant connections like Krongard's former role, fuels the argument Carter presents that a truly thorough public investigation into these financial anomalies might have been deliberately suppressed or curtailed, perhaps to avoid uncovering uncomfortable truths.
Okay, so beyond those specific suspicious trades, the arms industry itself was perhaps the most obvious and largest beneficiary of the post-9/11 world. Unsurprisingly right. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. Carter details how their stock values absolutely soared in the weeks, months, and years after 9/11. Billions upon billions of dollars flowed from the U.S. Treasury directly to these private defense corporations, all justified by the needs of national security and the newly declared global war on terror. This created, or certainly accelerated, what Carter calls the revolving door phenomenon. You had former high-ranking government officials, Pentagon brass, leaving public service and immediately joining the boards of these major defense contractors. And conversely, you had executives from those same companies taking senior advisory roles within the government, particularly in defense policy. It blurred the lines, didn't it, between national strategy and corporate salesmanship. Can you give us some specific examples of this revolving door that Carter points to in his book?
Absolutely. Carter provides several examples, though he focuses on the systemic nature of it. He describes how numerous high-ranking officials, assistant secretaries, generals, admirals, transitioned almost directly from positions setting defense policy or managing procurement within the Pentagon or other agencies straight into lucrative roles on the boards or in the executive suites of companies like Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, etc. This creates an environment, he argues, where decisions made supposedly in the public interest, particularly those involving massive military spending, long-term weapons programs, or decisions about war and deployment, can directly and massively benefit private companies with which these individuals have past ties, and perhaps more importantly, potential future financial interests. It's a systemic issue that inherently clouds accountability and arguably incentivizes perpetual conflict, or at least perpetual military spending.
And the profiteering, Carter shows, extended even further into the massive reconstruction contracts awarded in Iraq and Afghanistan, often with little or no oversight. Companies like Halliburton and its subsidiary KBR, famously headed by Dick Cheney before he became vice president, were granted billions upon billions of dollars in contracts, often no-bid contracts, meaning they didn't have to compete with other companies. These were justified by the urgency of the war situation. The consequences. Carter documents rampant waste, fraud, and abuse. Reports emerged constantly of massive overbilling for basic services, shoddy construction work that had to be redone, phantom projects billed for but never actually completed. Yet real accountability for this misuse of taxpayer funds seemed incredibly scarce. And Halliburton wasn't alone. Other huge firms like Bechtel, Floor, Parsons, DynCorp, even the private security firm Blackwater, later rebranded as Academy, they all carved out their substantial share of the reconstruction pie. What kind of specific examples of waste and fraud did Carter's sources describe in detail?
Oh, Carter's sources recount numerous specific, often quite shocking examples. Things like contractors charging the U.S. government, say, $100 for a standard bag of laundry that would cost a few dollars elsewhere, charging vastly inflated prices for fuel transport, billing for meals never served to troops. There were reports of entire facilities being built barracks, police stations in Iraq to such poor standards they were unusable almost immediately. Massive cost overruns on projects that were delayed for years or never completed at all. The argument Carter presents is that the sheer urgency invoked by the war on terror often meant that normal auditing procedures and oversight mechanisms were bypassed or simply overwhelmed, creating this fertile ground for unchecked profiteering on an industrial scale, all funded by the U.S. taxpayer.
And then back home, the creation of the massive Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, in 2002 further fueled this domestic profit engine. DHS's creation led to this vast new market, a huge network of government contracts for technology firms developing surveillance systems, construction companies building new facilities, and private security outfits providing guards and services. Airports got outfitted with expensive, often controversial, full-body scanning systems. Border patrols were massively expanded with new drones, sensors, and vehicles. Local police forces across the country received billions in federal grants distributed through DHS, allowing them to purchase military-grade equipment, armored vehicles, assault rifles, advanced surveillance gear. As Carter's source cynically notes, security was not simply about safety, it was about return on investment for a whole new industry. What did this explosion in the domestic security market mean for the daily lives of ordinary Americans, beyond just feeling, perhaps, more secure?
For ordinary citizens, Carter argues, it meant a significant and often quite visible expansion of surveillance and scrutiny in everyday life. Air travel became much more intrusive, obviously, with new screening technologies and increased collection of passenger data, like the no-fly list. But it also meant local police forces, newly equipped with military gear obtained through DHS grants, began to adopt more aggressive tactics in some communities. The use of SWAT teams for routine warrants increased. Military-style equipment started appearing at public protests. Carter argues it fostered the growth of a powerful security industrial complex here at home, where the default impulse was always towards acquiring more technology, implementing more surveillance programs, often with questionable evidence of their actual effectiveness in preventing terrorism, simply because there were huge financial incentives driving it.
And Carter points to key political figures who seemed to personally benefit, or at least had significant potential conflicts of interest. Vice President Dick Cheney is the most prominent example. As the former CEO of Halliburton, he reportedly retained deferred compensation and stock options worth millions of dollars even while in office. During his vice presidency, his former company, Halliburton KBR, secured enormous, often no-bid contracts related to the Iraq War worth billions. Carter's source states bluntly that the vice president sat at the intersection of public policy and private profit. Similarly, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, had long-standing ties to the defense industry before taking office. His aggressive push for expanded military spending, the transformation of the military, and particularly the decision to invade Iraq. These policies directly aligned with the financial interests of the very companies he had been connected to throughout his career. How did the U.S. government, or these figures themselves, officially justify these apparent conflicts of interest at the time?
Well, officially, these connections were generally dismissed as either perfectly legal, standard business dealings from their past private lives, or simply framed as a matter of experienced individuals bringing their expertise to serve their country in a time of crisis. Cheney, for instance, argued repeatedly that his deferred compensation and stock options from Halliburton were simply passive investments held in a blind trust, not an ongoing financial relationship influencing his decisions. Rumsfeld argued his actions were solely based on national security needs. However, Carter's research, echoing that of many other critics and investigative journalists, suggests these explanations felt insufficient to many. They point to the immense power wielded by individuals whose policy decisions seem to align remarkably well with the potential for huge private profits for themselves or their former corporate associates. The appearance of conflict, at the very least, was profound.
And then there's a crucial, though for a long time hidden, aspect of this whole financial trail, the connections involving Saudi Arabia. The infamous 28 pages, a section of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11 that was kept classified for over 13 years, were finally released in 2016, largely due to pressure from victims' families. And Carter emphasizes, these pages confirmed what many had long suspected, that individuals connected to the Saudi government had provided direct financial and logistical assistance to at least some of the 9/11 hijackers, particularly while they were living in the United States before the attacks. Specific names emerge in those pages and related investigations. Figures like Omar al-Bayoumi and Osama Basnin, alleged Saudi intelligence operatives or agents. They reportedly received financial support from Saudi officials, including members of the royal family, and were documented having numerous contacts with hijackers Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihar while they were living openly in San Diego, helping them find apartments, open bank accounts, and generally settle in.
And the level of political protection apparently extended to Saudi Arabia was strikingly evident in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. Carter highlights the controversial episode where chartered planes were allowed to fly numerous Saudi nationals, including members of Osama bin Laden's extended family, out of the United States. This happened at a time when all other civilian air traffic in the U.S. was completely grounded. Ordinary Americans couldn't fly anywhere. This act, Carter argues, became a powerful symbol of the extent of Saudi influence and the perception that geopolitical priorities, perhaps related to oil or counterterrorism cooperation, seemed to supersede immediate domestic security concerns or the need for thorough investigation of potential Saudi links. And the lawsuits filed against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by 9/11 victims' families. They've dragged on for decades, facing numerous legal and diplomatic obstacles thrown up by both Saudi and successive U.S. administrations. Carter suggests this demonstrates how, time again, the pursuit of justice seemed to be subordinated to complex geopolitics and the maintenance of delicate diplomatic relationships.
And Carter points out this profiteering wasn't just an American phenomenon, it had a global dimension. The wars that followed 9/11 dramatically reshaped global energy markets. Suddenly, Iraq's massive oil reserves, the second largest in the world outside Saudi Arabia, became potentially available to international oil companies in a way they hadn't been under Saddam Hussein. Carter cites reports and internal documents suggesting that the division of Iraq's oil fields among Western companies was actually a topic of discussion among policymakers and corporate executives well before 9/11 and the invasion. Foreign defense contractors also benefited hugely. Companies like BAE Systems in the UK, various European aerospace and arms firms, even Israel's sophisticated defense sector. They all saw their revenues climb dramatically as the global war on terror expanded and military budgets increased worldwide.
Carter summarizes it pretty starkly. He says essentially, the war on terror became a multinational business venture, and the implication is chilling. Tragedy, when commodified, becomes an engine that demands new crises to sustain itself. It creates a cycle. What is the critical takeaway from Carter's investigation into all these financial anomalies surrounding 9/11?
I think the critical takeaway, as Carter presents it, is that 9/11 wasn't just a human tragedy of immense proportions. It was also simultaneously a massive financial opportunity for a select group of well-connected individuals, corporations, and even nations. The suspicious stock trades hinting at possible foreknowledge, the explosion in defense spending enriching contractors, the opaque and often wasteful reconstruction contracts, the carefully protected Saudi connections. It all paints this disturbing picture where immense private profit was derived directly from immense public suffering and fear. It highlights, Carter argues, how powerful interests can expertly capitalize on moments of crisis, skillfully turning public fear and genuine calls for security into private wealth and expanded influence, often at the direct expense of transparency, accountability, and sometimes even justice.
So with all this power shifting, all this money flowing, it really begs the question, what exactly was happening behind the scenes, inside the intelligence community itself, in the months and years leading up to that fateful day?
You hear it all the time, right? That 9/11 was fundamentally a failure of imagination, that our intelligence agencies just couldn't conceive of terrorists using planes as missiles in that way. But Samuel Carter's work really pushes back hard against that narrative. The evidence he gathers shows, quite clearly he argues, that U.S. intelligence services had numerous warnings. They had informants in relevant places. They had active surveillance operations targeting key groups well before the attacks. Al-Qaeda, after all, wasn't some unknown quantity popping up out of nowhere. They'd been a known major threat since at least the mid-1990s. They bombed U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998. They attacked the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000. Many of the individuals involved in those earlier attacks, or linked to bin Laden, were actually on various watch lists. So Carter argues framing 9/11 primarily as a failure of imagination feels like a convenient deflection, maybe obscuring more specific failures of information sharing and action.
And one of the most glaring specific failures Carter details involves two of the men who would become 9/11 hijackers, Nauf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar. These guys were known figures. As early as January 2000, the CIA had solid intelligence that these two men had attended a significant meeting of suspected al-Qaeda terrorists in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The CIA even had photographs of them at this meeting. They knew who they were and who they were meeting with. Yet, and this is critical, when al-Hazmi and al-Mihdhar entered the United States later that year using their real names on visas, the CIA did not inform the FBI that these known terror suspects were now inside the country. So these two men lived openly in California for months. They took flight lessons, got driver's licenses using their real names, opened bank accounts, basically living freely. The FBI, the agency responsible for domestic threats, remained unaware of their presence and connections until mere weeks before the 9/11 attacks. Carter finds this delay utterly inexcusable and inexplicable based on standard procedure.
How? How could two men known by the CIA to be linked to al-Qaeda just live freely inside the U.S. for that long without the FBI being looped in? It remains one of the most damning unanswered questions of the whole pre-9/11 period. Carter's research points to this infamous wall, this metaphorical barrier that existed partly by law, partly by custom, between foreign intelligence gathering agencies like the CIA and the NSA and domestic law enforcement, primarily the FBI. Now, this wall was supposedly erected to protect civil liberties, right? To prevent the CIA from spying on Americans domestically, to keep intelligence separate from law enforcement. But Carter argues in this specific context, it inadvertently ended up protecting the attackers instead. It created these silos that prevented crucial, actionable intelligence from being shared across agencies. What was the official rationale cited after 9/11 for maintaining this wall, even when national security was so clearly at stake with known suspects?
Yeah, the official rationale given, both before and even defended by some after 9/11, was precisely that. Protecting civil liberties and preventing the potential abuses that could arise if foreign intelligence agencies were allowed to operate freely inside the U.S. or share all their raw intelligence with law enforcement without restriction. It was rooted in past controversies like COINTELPRO in the 60s and 70s. The goal was to maintain a clear legal and operational distinction between foreign threats, CIANSA, and domestic crime, FBI. However, Carter argues, and many investigations later confirm, that in the specific context of transnational terrorism, where threats easily cross those neat lines, this rigid distinction became a fatal flaw. Vital pieces of intelligence, like the presence of al-Hazmi and al-Mizr inside the U.S., fell into this bureaucratic crack. Information wasn't shared quickly or effectively, prioritizing established procedure and jurisdictional boundaries over the assessment of imminent threat. The system wasn't flexible enough.
And this wasn't just an isolated case involving those two, was it? Carter highlights how FBI field agents, the ones on the ground, repeatedly sent warnings up the chain of command that were ignored or downplayed by headquarters. There's the famous Phoenix memo from July 2001. An FBI agent in Arizona, Kenneth Williams, wrote this detailed memo warning that Middle Eastern men were enrolling in U.S. flight schools in unusual numbers. He specifically expressed concern they might be training for terrorist attacks, possibly involving planes. His warning, largely ignored, filed away by FBI headquarters. Then, even later, in August 2001, just 3 weeks before 9/11, you have the arrest of Zacharias Moussaoui in Minnesota. Flight instructors there got suspicious. He wanted to learn how to fly a massive Boeing 747 simulator, but bizarrely expressed no interest in learning takeoffs or landings, only how to steer the plane in midair. That rang alarm bells. Local FBI agents arrested him on immigration charges and urgently requested a warrant to search his laptop, convinced he was part of a larger imminent plot.
But that warrant request was denied by FBI headquarters. Why? They cited insufficient evidence to meet the probable cause standard at the time, possibly related to that wall preventing easy use of foreign intelligence connecting Moussaoui to radical groups. One of the frustrated Minnesota agents wrote this prescient, chilling email to headquarters afterwards, basically saying, this guy's going to kill Americans. It's just a question of how and when. 3 weeks later, the towers fell. And whistleblower testimony later from agents like Colleen Rowley in the Minneapolis office confirmed this pattern. They testified that their superiors at headquarters had actively blocked, slow-walked, or ignored their warnings and requests regarding Moussaoui, indicating a systemic issue of dismissal or bureaucratic inertia, not just an isolated oversight.
And then, looming over all of this, there's the August 6th, 2001 Presidential Daily Briefing, the PDB. This infamous intelligence document was delivered directly to President George W. Bush while he was on vacation at his ranch in Crawford, Texas. And the title wasn't subtle, it was blunt. Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. The content, Carter summarizes, pulled together intelligence stretching back a decade. It explicitly noted that al-Qaeda planned attacks inside the United States, that they'd explore using hijackings as a method, and warned that sleeper cells might already be in place, awaiting orders. It seems incredibly direct.
Incredibly direct. Yet, despite this alarming briefing reaching the very highest level, the official line afterwards was that no specific action followed. Condoleezza Rice, who was the national security advisor at the time and delivered the briefing, later famously stated that the PDB did not warn of any specific attack. It was historical information, essentially context, not an actionable warning. However, Carter's research strongly critiques this interpretation. He argues, citing counterterrorism experts, that if that PDB had been read with genuine urgency as a call to arms, rather than just historical context, concrete preventative measures could have been implemented immediately. For instance, flight schools nationwide could have been put on high alert, inspected for suspicious foreign students matching the profiles Williams and others had warned about. FAA security procedures at airports could have been immediately upgraded. NORAD could have been specifically briefed on the credible possibility of hijacked planes being used as weapons, potentially changing their readiness posture or rules of engagement, especially given the scenarios already being played out in those war games. What specific actions, according to Carter, could have been triggered by this PDB had it been taken more seriously as an imminent threat warning?
Carter suggests a range of actions could have flowed from taking that PDB seriously. Things like immediate widespread alerts issued to all flight schools instructing them to report any suspicious students, especially those fitting the profile described in the Phoenix memo or behaving like Moussaoui. He suggests airport security protocols could have been instantly heightened far beyond what was standard pre-9/11, more rigorous screening. Reinforced cockpit doors mandated immediately, federal air marshals deployed much more widely. And crucially, NORAD's readiness posture could have been formally elevated for domestic air threats, with clearer pre-authorization for intercepts or even shoot-downs under specific circumstances. Carter argues such actions, taken collectively in August, might have significantly disrupted elements of the 9/11 plot, or at the very least dramatically increased the chances of a successful intercept on the day.
And it wasn't just U.S. intelligence potentially missing signals. Carter documents how foreign intelligence agencies also apparently sounded alarms that were seemingly ignored or not properly integrated by the U.S. Israel, for instance. Reportedly provided several warnings to the United States in the months before 9/11 about potential large-scale al-Qaeda attacks, possibly involving aircraft, and may have even passed on names of specific individuals later identified as hijackers. Even more troubling, perhaps, are the reports that surfaced concerning Pakistan's powerful inter-services intelligence agency, the ISI. Specifically, allegations that the head of the ISI at the time, General Mahmoud Ahmad, had authorized a wire transfer of $100,000 to Mohammed Atta, the presumed lead hijacker, shortly before 9/11. And adding to the intrigue, General Ahmad was incredibly in Washington, D.C. on the morning of September 11th, having high-level meetings with U.S. officials, including figures at the CIA and State Department. These meetings were scheduled beforehand, but the timing and the alleged Atta connection are deeply suspicious to Carter's sources.
German intelligence also reportedly warned the U.S. about al-Qaeda figures training at flight schools and expressing interest in hijacking planes.
French intelligence provided similar warnings. Even Russia reportedly alerted Washington about impending threats.
It's just a staggering collection of apparently ignored or mishandled intelligence, isn't it? Coming from domestic field agents, from the CIA's own files, from the president's own briefing, and from multiple foreign allies and even rivals. Carter's work paints this picture where all these warnings, all these red flags just seem to disappear into the fog of bureaucracy, as he puts it. The cumulative effect was that by the summer of 2001, intelligence agencies around the world were sounding alarms, but the United States stood still. And let's just quickly revisit the war games again in this context. The overlap of those simulated war games, including scenarios of hijacked planes hitting buildings happening on the morning of 9/11. As we discussed, Carter shows this clearly created confusion that delayed the real-world response. But some analysts Carter cites suggest a potentially darker possibility that the war games weren't just an unfortunate coincidence, but might have actually provided intentional cover, deliberately blurring the line between exercise and reality, perhaps to hinder accountability or mask other activities. Carter doesn't endorse this, but presents it as a question raised by the bizarre overlap.
When you look at the sheer number of warnings, the specificity of some of the intelligence, like the Al-Hazmi al-Mitar case, and the documented instances of internal communication being blocked or warnings ignored, Carter argues it suggests something potentially more deliberate, or at least more systemically dysfunctional, than just simple failure or lack of imagination. And then he poses that critical, uncomfortable question: cui bono? Who benefited from this apparent failure? The answer, Carter suggests, seems clear if you look at what happened after 9/11. The massive expansion of budgets, legal authorities, and political influence that the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA received in the wake of the attacks, they gained unprecedented power and resources. It's a strange outcome, almost a reward for what was by any measure a catastrophic intelligence failure.
And it's just haunting, isn't it, to consider the fate of someone like John O'Neill? He was the former FBI counterterrorism chief, one of the most vocal, persistent voices warning about the al-Qaeda threat in the years before 9/11. He often clashed with his superiors, feeling they consistently underestimated the danger. Frustrated by the internal politics, the bureaucracy, the perceived obstruction, he actually left the FBI in the summer of 2001. And where did he go? He took a new job as head of security at the World Trade Center. He died there in the North Tower on 9/11. His death, Carter suggests, tragically eliminated one of the few high-level insiders who had demonstrated a willingness to consistently challenge the institutional inertia of the U.S. intelligence agencies and speak uncomfortable truths to power. The consequences of all these failures, these missed connections, these ignored warnings, They obviously extended far beyond the horrific events of that morning. They fundamentally reshaped American society, Carter argues, particularly its understanding of liberty and security.
Absolutely. I think the key insight from Carter in this section is that the popular narrative of a simple failure of imagination is deeply flawed, perhaps intentionally misleading. His research aims to demonstrate a clear pattern. Explicit warnings existed, crucial intelligence was gathered but not shared or acted upon, and internal dissent or alarms raised by agents on the ground were actively resisted or ignored by higher-ups. This suggests, Carter proposes, that the intelligence community wasn't necessarily blind. It was perhaps paralyzed by bureaucratic infighting, hampered by that rigid wall, or maybe in some instances even deliberately held back from acting decisively on certain information. Whatever the exact combination of factors, the result paved the way for the attacks and the profound, far-reaching consequences that followed, including a dramatic shift in civil liberties.
The attacks on 9/11 didn't just change the New York skyline or the Pentagon's facade. They provided the political justification, the catalyst for this sweeping transformation of American law, surveillance practices, and policing. A transformation that permanently, it seems, altered the balance between individual freedom and state security in the U.S. bursts. Carter's research points out something important here. Many of these dramatic changes, particularly laws like the USA Patriot Act, weren't spontaneously drafted in the weeks after 9/11 in response to the crisis. He argues many provisions were actually drafted long before the attacks, sitting on shelves, essentially waiting for a crisis to provide justification. So what was presented to the public as a necessary temporary emergency measure to fight terrorism soon evolved, Carter contends, into a permanent infrastructure of surveillance and control that has reshaped civil liberties for decades to come.
Yeah, the expansion of surveillance powers was drastic and almost immediate. The Patriot Act itself, its full name, is incredibly long, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intersect and obstruct terrorism act. It was rushed through Congress and signed into law just weeks after 9/11, with very little debate or even understanding of its full implications by many lawmakers. It drastically expanded the government's authority to access personal records, phone logs, financial transactions, library records, electronic communications, often with far less judicial oversight, like lower standards for warrants, than was previously required. The National Security Agency, the NSA, which was once legally limited primarily to monitoring foreign communications, began secretly monitoring domestic phone calls and internet traffic on a massive scale, programs later exposed by whistleblowers like Edward Snowden. They collected metadata, who called whom, when, for how long, on billions of calls involving ordinary Americans, mapping social networks across entire populations. Carter argues that the presumption of privacy, which was once considered a bedrock principle of American life, was quietly but systematically eroded. We were told, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But Carter's work strongly reminds us, quoting civil liberties advocates, that in a functioning democracy, the right to privacy isn't conditional on innocence. It's a fundamental safeguard against potential government overreach and tyranny. It protects dissent.
And this expansion went beyond just the federal intelligence agencies, didn't it? The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, created in 2002 by merging 22 different federal agencies, established these things called fusion centers all across the country. These centers were designed to link federal, state, and local law enforcement, sharing intelligence and data. But Carter details how they often went far beyond tracking suspected terrorists. Reports and leaked documents later revealed that many fusion centers were collecting and sharing data on peaceful protest movements, environmental groups, anti-war activists, even religious organizations groups with absolutely no connection to terrorism. They became tools for monitoring dissent. And the knowledge that this kind of surveillance could be happening, whether it was or not in every case, created this palpable, chilling effect. Activists, journalists, even ordinary citizens began to self-censor, assuming their emails might be read, their calls monitored, their meeting attendance logged electronically. Carter argues this fundamentally diminished the space for open public discourse and protest. What were the specific legal arguments the government used at the time to justify this unprecedented level of mass surveillance on its own citizens?
Well, the government's legal justifications were often complex and sometimes relied on controversial interpretations of existing laws, like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, or arguments based on the inherent powers of the president during wartime or national emergency. They argue these new surveillance powers were absolutely essential to connect the dots and prevent future catastrophic attacks like 9/11. They framed it as a necessary trade-off. Slightly less privacy for significantly more security. Regarding the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, government lawyers developed theories arguing that collecting metadata, for instance, wasn't a search in the traditional sense because it didn't involve the content of communications, only the data about them. Or they argued that the compelling need for national security in the post-9/11 era outweighed individual privacy concerns in certain contexts. However, Carter's research makes clear that many legal scholars, judges, and civil liberties groups strongly contested these interpretations from the very beginning. They warned, often presciently, about the long-term dangers of eroding constitutional protections and creating secret surveillance programs, operating outside meaningful public or judicial oversight.
And the erosion of traditional legal norms wasn't confined just to surveillance, was it? Detention powers were also radically expanded. Under new laws and executive orders, non-citizens merely suspected of having links to terrorism could be detained indefinitely, potentially for years, without trial, without even being formally charged with a crime. Military tribunals, operating with different rules of evidence and fewer protections for the accused than civilian courts, were authorized to try suspected terrorists. Often, these tribunals could rely on secret evidence that the defendant couldn't see or challenge. And Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. It became the stark global symbol of this new reality. Hundreds of individuals captured in the War on Terror, many under dubious circumstances, were held there for years, often without charge, subjected to harsh interrogation techniques widely condemned as torture, and denied basic legal rights like habeas corpus, all while being kept deliberately outside the reach of the traditional U.S. legal system.
And even more disturbing, perhaps, was the CIA's secret program of extraordinary rendition and its network of clandestine black sites around the world. This involved the abduction, essentially kidnapping, of terror suspects from various countries and transporting them, outside of any legal process, to secret prisons operated by the CIA or cooperating foreign governments. In these black sites, detainees were subjected to brutal enhanced interrogation techniques, methods like waterboarding, sleep deprivation for days on end, confinement in small boxes, extreme stress positions methods that the U.S. itself had previously prosecuted as torture when used by other regimes. These sites operated entirely outside the law, shrouded in secrecy, shielded from scrutiny by layers of classification and official denial for years. What did the international community, particularly human rights organizations, say about these practices like rendition and black sites when they eventually came to light?
Oh, the condemnation was almost universal and incredibly strong. Major international human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Committee of the Red Cross, as well as the United Nations and many allied governments. They unequivocally condemned extraordinary rendition and the use of black sites as involving systematic torture and constituting gross violations of international law, including the Geneva Conventions and the UN Convention Against Torture. They argued these programs were a deliberate attempt by the U.S. administration to circumvent both U.S. constitutional protections and international legal obligations, creating a dangerous precedent where individuals could simply disappear into a lawless void.
And back on the home front, domestic policing was also profoundly transformed by the post-9/11 security state. As we touched on, those federal grants flowing through DHS allowed local and state police departments across America to acquire military-grade equipment. Armored personnel carriers, high-powered assault rifles, flashbang grenades, advanced surveillance drones. Gear once primarily reserved for soldiers on foreign battlefields started appearing on American streets. And Carter notes, police departments often deployed this new gear, not primarily against terrorists, but increasingly against protesters during demonstrations, like Occupy Wall Street or later BLM protests, and even sometimes in routine policing situations, contributing to what many critics call the militarization of domestic law enforcement. Meanwhile, whistleblowers within the government who attempted to raise alarms about civil liberties abuses, intelligence failures, or illegal programs faced harsh retaliation. Carter mentions FBI translator Sybil Edmonds, who tried to report security breaches and espionage. She was fired and gagged under the rarely used state secrets privilege. FBI agent Colleen Rowley, who exposed the mishandling of the Moussaoui warnings, faced internal backlash. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaffer, who worked on the Able Danger program that reportedly identified Adam before 9/11, was also gagged and his security clearance revoked. Their dissent, their attempts to warn or expose problems, were treated not as valuable service but as betrayal.
And the courts, traditionally seen as the ultimate safeguard of civil liberties against government overreach. Carter observes that in the prevailing climate of fear after 9/11, the judiciary often deferred heavily to the executive branch on matters of national security. While there were some important court rulings over the years that did curb the most egregious abuses, like limits on indefinite detention at Guantanamo, Many decisions, particularly in the early years, upheld the government's expanded surveillance and detention powers as necessary, perhaps unavoidable in extraordinary times. The erosion of liberty, as Carter points out, wasn't really imposed by just one branch of government. It was arguably facilitated, or at least permitted, by a degree of acquiescence across all branches. And the tragedy, Carter suggests, is that what was initially presented as temporary, emergency measures largely became permanent. The emergency, in effect, never truly ended. This gradual erosion of civil liberties became the new normal, accepted by many Americans, perhaps reluctantly, as the necessary price of safety. What long-term impact does Carter suggest this persistent state of exception had on public trust in government and its institutions?
Carter argues that this normalization of exceptional powers, often justified through the constant invocation of fear and the terrorist threat, created a profound and potentially lasting erosion of public trust. Not just trust in specific politicians, but in the fundamental institutions of government and the rule of law itself. When surveillance becomes pervasive and seemingly accepted, when accountability for abuses like torture or illegal spying is scarce or non-existent, citizens can become cynical. They may become less willing to engage critically with their government, less likely to participate in dissent, leading potentially to a more passive, less vibrant, and ultimately less democratic society. The emergency framework, once established, proved very difficult to dismantle, and the expansion of state power became self-perpetuating.
The irony is just so profound, isn't it? 9/11 was constantly framed by leaders as an attack on freedom itself. We were told the terrorists hated America for its liberties, its openness, its democratic way of life. Yet, as Carter meticulously documents, in the name of defending freedom, freedom was systematically restricted. In the name of protecting democracy, core democratic principles like privacy, due process, and dissent were significantly weakened. Fundamental rights were curtailed in ways that would have been unthinkable before that day. Hashtag outro. Okay, we have covered a vast, incredibly intricate landscape of questions and challenges today. We've journeyed through the anomalies, the unanswered queries, the contradictions that emerge from Samuel Carter's detailed research in Smoke, Steel, and Silence. Let's just try and briefly recap the core findings, the main areas of questioning that really stand out from his work. First, we dug into those air defense failures, the absolutely inexplicable inability to intercept even one of the 4 hijacked planes, despite clear warnings, established procedures, and that proven track record of routine intercepts right up until 900. Critically compounded, Carter argues, by the intense confusion generated by those simultaneous overlapping war games simulating the exact same scenario. The key insight there seems to be that the system wasn't just caught unprepared, it was actively hampered by this perfect storm of miscommunication, jurisdictional paralysis, and blurred realities.
Then we delve deep into the Pentagon's many lingering questions. The profound lack of clear, publicly released video evidence showing the aircraft's impact. The persistent controversy over the size of the entry hole compared to the massive wingspan of a Boeing 757, the baffling absence of large identifiable wreckage, especially the engines, the incredible, almost superhuman flight skills attributed to an allegedly incompetent pilot, and the frankly chilling convenience of the impact location hitting the newly reinforced, largely unoccupied section. The key insight Carter presents is that the official narrative for the Pentagon attack seems to rely heavily on accepting specific interpretations of quite limited evidence, while simultaneously dismissing or failing to adequately explain really glaring physical anomalies and contradictory eyewitness accounts.
We dove headfirst into the physics-defying WTC collapses. The unscientific, near free-fall speed of the destruction of all 3 buildings, including WTC-7, which wasn't hit by a plane. The symmetry of the collapses, straight down into their own footprints, resembling controlled demolitions. The persistent documented reports of molten metal, accounts of explosions preceding and during the collapses, accounts often redacted from official reports. And the sheer, almost unbelievable completeness of the pulverization of concrete and steel into fine dust. The key insight there, Carter argues forcefully, is that the physics themselves seem to scream questions, strongly suggesting a mechanism of destruction far beyond what conventional office fires and impact damage alone can plausibly explain, according to the experts he cites.
We then examine the media's crucial role in shaping the story. The immediate formation of a remarkably unified narrative across virtually all outlets, the swift and often harsh suppression of dissenting voices or inconvenient questions, and Carter's documentation of the undeniable financial ties between major media conglomerates and the defense industry, ties that he argues actively shaped public perception towards accepting war and retribution, rather than demanding critical inquiry and accountability. The core insight Carter offers is that the media, in that crucial moment of national crisis, largely abandoned its traditional watchdog role, instead becoming a powerful amplifier for the official narrative and its subsequent far-reaching policy outcomes.
This led us directly into the disturbing issue of profiteering from tragedy. The highly suspicious stock market trades placed just before 9/11, betting on disaster, the subsequent explosion of billions, even trillions of dollars flowing to defense and reconstruction contractors, often with minimal oversight or accountability, the documented instances of personal enrichment or significant conflicts of interest involving key political figures like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and the critical Saudi connections to the hijackers that were deliberately buried for years within classified government documents. The key insight Carter drives home is that 9/11 wasn't just an unparalleled human tragedy. It was also, simultaneously and perhaps cynically, exploited as a massive financial opportunity for a select, well-connected few, effectively capitalizing on national trauma for immense private gain.
And we investigated the troubling evidence surrounding intelligence failures and potential hidden hands. The numerous specific warnings from FBI field agents and foreign allies that were apparently ignored or mishandled. The documented instances of deliberate withholding of crucial information between agencies like the CIA and FBI due to the wall. And the truly troubling reality Carter highlights that catastrophic failure was not punished, but in fact seemingly rewarded with unprecedented expansions of power, budgets, and influence for the entire intelligence community. The profound insight here, Carter argues, is that the simplistic failure of imagination narrative is deeply flawed. Crucial intelligence was available, but a disturbing pattern of internal resistance, bureaucratic paralysis, and potentially deliberate suppression prevented it from being acted upon effectively.
And finally, we analyzed the profound and lasting erosion of civil liberties in the wake of 9/11. The rapid, almost undebated passage of the sweeping USA Patriot Act, the subsequent secret expansion of mass government surveillance on ordinary Americans, the normalization of indefinite detention without trial at places like Guantanamo Bay, and the use of torture in CIA black sites, and the pervasive militarization of domestic policing, all systematically implemented, justified by fear, and resulting in a tangible shrinking of the space for individual freedom, privacy, and dissent in America. The key insight Carter leaves us with is the deep irony that in the very name of defending freedom from attack, foundational American liberties were progressively dismantled, arguably transforming the fundamental nature of American society itself.
What they did not tell us, Carter powerfully concludes, is that the response to 9/11 was not simply about defense, it was also about opportunity. The sweeping legal changes, the vastly expanded surveillance state, the subsequent wars, these were just reactive measures born solely of the crisis. They were also, he contends, a series of choices. Choices made in the shadow of fear, yes, but choices that also serve powerful interests and fundamentally transform the nation in profound and enduring ways. Accountability, in so many respects, feels like the missing chapter in the long story of 9/11 and its complex aftermath. The truth, Carter insists, demands transparency. It requires open debate, a willingness to confront uncomfortable questions, and truly independent oversight. Democracy, he argues, simply cannot survive in the long run if truth becomes optional and accountability becomes negotiable based on political convenience.
And demanding that truth, demanding accountability, isn't disloyal. Carter makes this point strongly. It is, in fact, arguably the highest form of patriotism. True patriotism isn't blind obedience. It's holding power accountable, asking the difficult questions, especially when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. The betrayal of the memory of those who died on 9/11 and the countless others affected by the policies that followed wasn't just national, it was global. So perhaps we can leave you, our listeners, with this provocative thought drawn from Carter's work. The towers fell in a single morning, but the foundations of democracy, the bedrock of civil liberties, have perhaps been crumbling much more quietly, but just as significantly ever since. What they did not tell us, Carter suggests, is that perhaps the greatest danger was not only in the planes or the bombs of that day, but in the silence that followed, the silence surrounding the unanswered questions, the suppressed evidence, the avoided accountability.
Silence. It's always been the enemy of liberty throughout history, hasn't it? It was the enemy in times of slavery, in times of segregation, during times of unjust war and unchecked power. And Carter argues it is the enemy still. Breaking that silence, demanding answers, engaging with these difficult questions, that's the necessary first step toward any kind of genuine recovery or reckoning. Truth, in this context, isn't merely an academic matter of getting the history right. Carter frames it as a matter of survival for freedom itself. To truly honor the victims of 9/11, he proposes, is to refuse silence. To honor their memory is to confront the difficult truth potentially hidden in the smoke and steel, and to resist the seductive comfort of ignorance or convenient narratives. What stands out most to you from this deep dive into Carter's challenging work?
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved. With courage and with honor, we'll hold our ground for freedom, for tradition, in this land we found. We cherish our Constitution, the words that set us free, the right to bear arms, to speak and to agree. We honor our forefathers who fought with steadfast might for the dream of a nation shining bright in the night. In every town and village, in every heart and home, we'll uphold our principles. Together we'll roam. Through trials and through triumphs, we'll never lose our way. With conservative values leading us day by day, we're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved. With courage and with honor, we'll hold our ground for freedom, for tradition, in this land we found. So here's to the brave, to the strong, to the free, to the spirit that binds us from sea to shining sea. We'll dive deep into our values, hold them close and true. For conservative hearts, there's no limit to what we can do. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved. With courage and with honor, we'll hold our ground for freedom, for tradition, in this land we found.